And the question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and in the time that remains, I can say some pretty clear and simple things about this bill. It's not impressive in itself. I don't think there's much evidence that it's going to do anything to address homelessness or people at risk of homelessness in this country, and it points to the glaring absence of policy and program action by the government in this space. And we know that homelessness is a pressing issue in Australia, and despite the government spending a lot of time talking about how great the economy is, there are a lot of people who are not experiencing that. And in terms of people who are experiencing homelessness or facing circumstances of insecure housing, that has got worse. Earlier this year, Homelessness Australia pointed out that there are 195,000 Australian households waiting for social housing. There's a shortfall of nearly 500,000 affordable homes across Australia, and each year 300,000 Australians attend homelessness services for help. So there's a desperate need for action on this front, and yet the government kind of bowls up with this bill that really is sort of fundamentally punitive. It will make the ability to sort of apply mandatory rental deductions available to state and territory jurisdictions, even though there's no real evidence that that will achieve anything. In the material that the Senate inquiry considered, and that the Parliamentary Library has provided, over the 5 years from 2011-12 to 15-16, national rent collection rates have averaged over 99% across public housing, community housing, state-owned and managed Indigenous housing. 86% of all households that currently live in public and social housing are already making use of voluntary rent deductions. So there's no great kind of gap to be addressed in terms of the use of rent deductions where it's appropriate. There's no revenue problem as far as the return of rents from public, community and social housing, and rental arrears in themselves are not a significant cause of homelessness. You know, all the evidence to the Senate inquiry and all the evidence that we've seen from sectoral stakeholders in recent times show that the causes of homelessness are things like mental illness, substance abuse, family violence and so on. So there's already in place a mechanism for people to opt in to rental deductions if that's going to help them stay in housing, and there's no evidence to suggest that sort of making that mandatorily the case is really going to deliver any significant change. What would, of course, deliver some significant change is increased funding to address all of those things I mentioned before. I mean, 300,000 Australians attend homelessness services each year. Last year, 66,000 people were turned away from homelessness support services, and yet earlier this year, when the government came along with what I sort of termed at the time the NHA, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement Bill, really just maintained the status quo as far as the National Affordable Housing Agreement and the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness are concerned. There was no growth funding to support social housing growth, nor was there any growth funding when it comes to the services that actually support people facing homelessness. More than that, in terms of its wreckage, its sort of relentlessly negative agenda, the government that will come to be known for the things that it damaged and got rid of will be known in this space for getting rid of the Housing Help for Seniors pilot, for defunding homelessness and community housing peak bodies, and for abolishing the National Housing Supply Council. So that's the record of this government, and it turns up here late in 2018 in the face of that aching need, in the face of the kind of gross inadequacy of the Commonwealth when it comes to meaningful action to deal with and provide, to deal with homelessness and to provide better services and more affordable housing, and it instead proposes simply something that's more punitive to mandatorily extract rent from people when they have the opportunity to opt into that if they like, and there's no evidence to suggest that if it's imposed upon them that it's going to do anything meaningful to help them in their circumstances. That's why, of course, Labor has flagged a series of amendments that would mean that you would only ever contemplate the mandatory application of rent deductions when you'd already ensure that there was proper counselling, proper financial services considerations. You'd only do it after there was already a substantial period of rental arrears. You would cap the amount that could be deducted. You ensure that it would only apply to rental arrears and arrears in relation to utilities and not to property damage, because there is evidence that if you go down that path, you will cause harm and you will cause damage to people who are already disadvantaged. And I'd sort of make the point, and my colleague here beside me would know, that it's sort of passing strange that you'd even look at something like this then when you've got no appetite for dealing with consumer leases, when you've got no appetite for dealing with payday lending. So if you really want to look at people who are in difficult financial circumstances, the last thing you go and do is just sort of whack on this additional punitive measure when you're doing nothing to address the causes of homelessness, you're doing nothing to address an increase in social housing stock. You're not looking to get out the shonks and the predators in payday lending and commercial leases. And I'll just finish by saying, on the day that the Minister for Women was trumpeting the statement that's supposed to look to provide financial security for women, they have withdrawn funding under the Women's Safety Package that supports critical family and domestic violence programs in Western Australia. So they might start by focusing on those practical things rather than the production of glossy pamphlets.